He told her to leave before the town could turn against her, but she stepped closer instead and said something that made him forget how to walk away. The wind snaps against the fence as Gideon's hand tightens on the wood, his knuckles pale beneath worn leather. "You're too young for this," he says, voice low, not looking at her. Ivy doesn't step back. Dusty shifts in the dirt between them, ears up, waiting. The gate creaks somewhere behind her. She leans in just enough for him to hear her breath. Then she whispers, soft, steady, and everything in his chest goes still. "Would you have stayed or walked away?" The first frost came early that year along the Absaroka Range. It settled quiet over the grass, turning each blade silver before the sun had a chance to touch it. Gideon Hale was already awake when the light broke over the ridge. He moved the same way he always did, slow, steady, without wasted motion. Saddle first. Cinch pulled tight, a gloved hand running along the leather as if checking for something he already knew wasn't there. The horse shifted once, then stood still again. By the time the sun cleared the peaks, Gideon was out along the north fence line. Wire stretched taut between weathered posts, one loose staple near the creek bed. He fixed it without thinking, hammer tapping in a rhythm that matched the quiet around him. There wasn't much sound out there. Wind, mostly. The kind that moved low through the grass and carried the smell of dry earth and pine. Sometimes a hawk, sometimes nothing at all. He ate at noon. Cold bread, a slice of cured meat, coffee poured from a dented tin pot. He sat on the porch step, boots planted in the dust, looking out at land that didn't ask him for anything. By late afternoon, the chores were done. By evening, the light dropped fast behind the mountains, leaving the ranch in that gray-blue stillness that came just before full dark. It had been that way for years. 12 miles down the road, the town of Larkspur moved on without him. He rode in once a week, same day, same hour, the same hitching post outside the general store, worn smooth where the rope wrapped tight. Folks tipped their hats when they saw him. Some said his name. Most didn't. "Afternoon, Gideon." He'd nod. That was enough. Inside the store, the air smelled of flour sacks and lamp oil, shelves lined with canned goods, bolts of cloth, small things meant to last longer than they looked. Mr. Calder at the counter didn't ask questions anymore. He just rang things up. "Salt blocks?" Gideon nodded. "Coffee?" Another nod. A small paper sack slid across the counter. Coins clinked. No hurry on either side. He stepped back into the daylight, loaded his supplies, and would have ridden straight out like always. But that morning, something caught. "Excuse me." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried clean across the space between the schoolhouse steps and the hitching rail. Gideon paused with one hand on the saddle horn, turned just enough to see her. She stood at the top of the wooden steps, one hand resting on the doorframe. Dark hair pulled back loose, a few strands caught in the breeze. A plain dress, dust along the hem from the road. Nothing about her tried to stand out, except the way she looked at him. Straight, steady, like she had already decided he was worth speaking to. "You wouldn't happen to know who fixes stoves around here?" she asked. "Mine's been smoking something awful. I can't keep the classroom warm past noon." Gideon held her gaze a moment longer than he meant to. "Tom Weller," he said, "hardware shop near the feed store. Tell him I sent you. He'll do it right." She nodded once, like she expected that answer. "Thank you." There was a pause then, the kind that usually ends a conversation, but she didn't turn away. "I'm Ivy Reed," she said. "I teach here." "I know," Gideon answered. She tilted her head just slightly. "I figured you might." He adjusted his grip on the saddle. Could have left. Should have. but his hand stayed where it was. "Gideon Hale," he said after a second. "I ranch north of here." "I know," she said again. That was it. No smile that lingered too long. No extra words. Just two people standing in the open air, the wind moving between them like it had been there before either of them arrived. Gideon gave a small nod, pulled himself into the saddle, and turned the horse toward the road out of town. He didn't look back, but he didn't push the horse to a faster pace either. The ride home felt longer that day. The mountains sat the same way they always did. The fence lines hadn't changed. The gate creaked on the same hinge. Everything was where it had been. Still, something didn't settle quite right. He unsaddled the horse in the fading light, hung the gear in its place, checked the latch on the barn twice without noticing he'd already done it. Inside, the house held its usual silence. A table, a chair, a bed in the corner room, a shelf with a few books he hadn't opened in years. He built a small fire in the stove, set the tin pot on top, waited. The water took its time to heat, the kind of slow boil that matched the rest of the day. When it was ready, he reached for a cup, then, without thinking, reached for another. 2 cups sat side by side on the table, steam curled up in thin lines, catching the last light from the window. Gideon stood there, one hand resting on the back of the chair. He didn't move right away, didn't pour, just stood, looking at the second cup like it belonged to someone he hadn't invited. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the walls, slipping through the cracks like it always did. Nothing had changed. And yet, for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't sit quite as easy as it used to. He pulled the second cup back a few inches, not enough to put it away, just enough to make space between them. Then he poured the coffee into one. The other stayed empty. For a moment longer, he kept his hand there, fingers resting against the rim. Then he turned, took his seat, and drank in silence. The second cup sat where it was, catching the last of the fading light, waiting. Morning came the way it always did. Cold first, then pale light sliding over the ridge. Gideon moved through it without pause. Saddle, fence, water trough by the lower pasture. By the time the sun reached the tops of the pines, the frost had lifted. The ground softened just enough to leave a print. There was a set of tracks near the front gate by noon. Not deep. Light. A smaller boot. Gideon noticed them without stopping. He followed the fence line instead, hammer in hand, tapping a loose nail back into place. Dusty lifted his head before Gideon heard anything. The old dog stood slow, tail giving a low, steady sweep. Gideon turned then. She stood outside the gate, one hand resting on the top rail. Same dress as before, though the hem carried a little more dust now. A book tucked under her arm. "I didn't want to come in uninvited," Ivy said. Gideon leaned the hammer against the post, walked over. The gate gave its usual creak when he pushed it open. "You can come in," he said. She nodded once, stepped through, careful not to brush against him as she passed, not pulling away either. Dusty circled once, then settled down near the porch, as if the matter had already been decided. "I went by to see Thomas Aldridge," she said, holding up the book slightly. "He's missed 3 days this week." "His pa's been short on hands," Gideon said. "Harvest coming in late." "I thought I'd stop on the way back," she added. Gideon gave a small nod. Nothing more. They stood a moment in the yard. Wind moved through the grass, low and steady. Somewhere beyond the barn, a loose board knocked once, then stilled. "Your gate hinge is worn," she said after a second. Gideon glanced at it, then at her. "I'll fix it." She smiled just a little, not at him, more at the fact that he hadn't argued. He fetched the tools without speaking. A wrench, a handful of screws from a tin box on the shelf. The metal was cool in his palm. She didn't step closer, just watched from a few feet away, one hand resting lightly against the wood of the fence. "You always work this side of the property first?" she asked. "Mornings," he said. "Light's better." She nodded like she was storing that away. When he finished, he tested the hinge twice. The gate swung clean, no sound but the soft shift of wood. "That should hold," he said. "I figured it would," she answered. Another pause. It didn't feel empty. He looked toward the house, then back at her. "You want coffee?" The words came out plain, like he hadn't thought about them. She took a second before answering, not out of hesitation, just enough to mark the moment. "I would." Inside, the house carried its usual stillness. The same chair, the same table, the same second cup sitting just where it had been left. Gideon reached for the pot, poured without comment. She set the book down near the edge of the table, not too close to his side, not too far either. Steam rose between them. She took her cup the way she had taken everything so far. Direct. No fuss. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They sat. Outside, Dusty shifted once on the porch, then went still again. "You've read this?" she asked, sliding the book a little toward him. Gideon glanced at the cover. Cattle Management. Older edition. Worn spine. "Years ago." "I thought so," she said. "Still seemed worth bringing." He ran a thumb along the edge of the pages. Didn't open it. They talked some. Not much. Weather turning colder. Ground getting harder. A boy who didn't like arithmetic but could handle a horse better than most grown men. No one asked questions that didn't need asking. When she left, she didn't linger. Just stood, gathered her book, and stepped back out into the yard. "I'll come by next week," she said. Gideon didn't answer right away. "Tuesday?" she added. He nodded once. "Tuesday." She closed the gate behind her. It didn't creak. Dusty watched her go until the road dipped out of sight. Then he lay his head back down on his paws. Gideon stayed where he was. Inside, the second cup was empty now. That evening, he fixed the porch step that had been loose since spring. Took longer than it should have. He measured twice, cut clean, set the nails straight. The next morning, the town began to notice. Not loudly, not at first. At the feed store, a glance held a little longer than usual. At the dry goods counter, a voice lowered just enough to carry. "She's been out that way." Teachers making her rounds. Twice in 1 week? Harold Whitaker stood near the counter, hands folded over the head of his cane. He didn't say much. Didn't need to. His son had sent flowers to the schoolhouse 2 days before. A whole bundle of them. The children had taken them apart by the end of the afternoon. Ivy had left the stems in a jar by the window. By Friday morning, she walked into the fabric shop on Main Street. The bell above the door gave its usual ring. The woman behind the counter looked up, then down again. "I need 2 yards of calico," Ivy said. The woman's hands stayed where they were, folded over the cloth. "We're short on stock," she said. Ivy glanced at the shelf behind her, bolts stacked neat, full. "I see," she answered. No argument, no change in tone. She stepped back outside into the light. Across the street, 2 men stood near the hitching rail. Their conversation paused just long enough to follow her as she walked past. She didn't hurry. Didn't slow down either. Just kept moving. Out past the last building, toward the road that led north. The wind picked up behind her, carrying dust across the boards, brushing at the hem of her dress. By the time she reached the bend, the town was quiet again, like it had been before she ever arrived. The wind carried dust along the road, smoothing over her footprints as if they had never been there. Ivy didn't look back. She kept her pace steady, one hand holding her skirt just above the ground, where the dirt rose in soft clouds with every step. At the far edge of town, the road split. One path bent toward the creek and the Aldridge place. The other ran north, thin and pale against the land, toward Gideon Hale's ranch. She paused there for a moment. Not long, just enough for the wind to shift. Then she turned north. Gideon was in the lower pasture when Harold Whitaker found him. The older man didn't ride fast. He never did. His horse moved at a careful, measured walk, like it understood its rider's habits. By the time Gideon noticed him, he was already near the fence. Gideon kept working. Wire tightened between his hands, gloved fingers pulling it firm against the post. He didn't stop. Didn't look up until the shadow fell across the ground beside him. "Afternoon," Harold said. Gideon nodded once. Harold rested both hands over the top of his cane, though he didn't need it out here. Not really. It was something he carried for presence, not support. "I hear you've had company." Gideon twisted the wire one last time. "Let it go." "She's a school teacher," he said. "She visits families." Harold gave a small sound. Not quite agreement. "Twice a week, from what I'm told." Gideon reached for his hammer, checked the next post without answering. The older man watched him for a moment longer than most would. "You're a decent man, Hale," Harold said finally. "Always have been." Gideon didn't turn. But decent men can still make mistakes. The wind picked up, pushing a loose strand of grass against the fence. Gideon drove a nail into the wood. One strike. Clean. "Is there something you need?" he asked. Harold shifted his weight slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to mark the change. "My son had an interest," he said. "In the teacher." Gideon said nothing. "She declined him." Another pause. Harold tapped the ground once with the end of his cane. "Women like that don't stay long in places like this," he went on. "Not without good reason." Gideon straightened then, turned just enough to face him. "Then I suppose she'll leave when she's ready." Harold held his gaze. "Or she'll be persuaded to," he said. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Gideon bent again, picked up the wire and kept working. The conversation was over. Harold watched him a second longer, then turned his horse and rode back the way he came. That evening, the house stayed dark. Gideon sat at the table with his hands resting flat against the wood. The second chair across from him was empty. The coffee pot sat cold on the stove. Dusty lay near the door, head on his paws, eyes half open. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, the kind of steady pressure that didn't break anything, but didn't leave either. Gideon didn't light the lamp. He didn't reach for the cups. He just sat. 2 days later, Ivy stood in the middle of Main Street with 3 men blocking her path. They weren't close, not touching, just near enough to make space feel smaller than it should. One of them leaned against the hitching rail, boot hooked up on the lower rung. "You headed out again?" he asked, voice easy in a way that didn't match his eyes. Ivy adjusted the book in her hands, kept her gaze level. "I have work to do," she said. "Out north?" another one added. She didn't answer that. The first man pushed off the rail, took a step forward, not enough to crowd her, enough to shift the air. "Road's a long one," he said. "Might not be safe for someone traveling alone." Before she could reply, a shadow crossed the ground between them. Gideon didn't speak. He just stepped into the space beside her, close enough that the men had to look past him to see her. His hat brim cast a line of shade across his face. His hands hung loose at his sides. He didn't reach for anything, didn't raise his voice. He just stood there. The man nearest him held his gaze for a second, then looked away. Wasn't saying nothing, he muttered, stepping back. The others followed. Boots shifted. Dust settled. The street opened again. Gideon didn't look at Ivy right away. He watched the men walk off, waited until they turned the corner past the feed store. Then he stepped back. "You all right?" he asked. Ivy nodded. "I was," she said, "but thank you." He tipped his head once. That should have been the end of it. But something lingered. He could feel it. The same way he felt a storm before it came over the ridge. Not loud, just present. "I won't be by this week," he said suddenly. She looked at him then. "I've got work to catch up on." It wasn't untrue, but it wasn't the whole of it either. Ivy studied him for a moment, not pressing, not asking why. "All right," she said. She stepped past him, careful again not to brush against him. He turned slightly as she went, watched her walk down the street, past the storefronts, past the place where the road began to narrow. She didn't look back. That afternoon, the gate at Gideon's ranch stayed closed. The wind came hard from the west, rattling the loose boards along the barn. Near sunset, hoofbeats slowed at the edge of the property. Ivy stopped at the gate. She didn't call out, didn't step down. For a long moment, she sat there, looking at the house beyond the yard. No smoke from the chimney, no movement on the porch. Dusty barked once from inside, then quieted. Ivy reached into her satchel, pulled out the book she had brought the week before. She leaned forward in the saddle and set it carefully on the top rail. The wind caught the pages for a second, flipping them once before they settled. She rested her hand there, just for a breath. Then she turned her horse. The gate didn't move. The book stayed where it was. And the yard, for the first time since she had started coming, remained empty. By morning, frost had settled over the cover. The pages curled slightly at the edges, where the night air had touched them. Gideon found it when he stepped out to check the gate. He stood there longer than needed. Didn't pick it up right away. Dusty came up beside him, nose low, tail still. The old dog looked at the book, then up at Gideon, waiting for something that didn't come. Gideon finally reached down, brushed the frost off with the side of his glove. The paper felt colder than it should. He turned it once in his hand. Didn't open it, just carried it inside and set it on the table. The second cup sat where it always had. He didn't move it. The wind shifted that afternoon, coming down from the mountains with a harder edge. By evening, the sky had gone the color of old steel. Gideon saddled up without thinking much about it. Rode out past the lower pasture, past the creek, all the way to the far fence line where the land opened wide toward the peaks. That's where he saw her. Ivy stood near the post where the fence dipped slightly, one hand resting on the top rail. Her horse was tied a few yards back, head down, breathing slow. She didn't turn when he rode up. She had already heard him. Gideon swung down from the saddle. Let the reins fall loose. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry sound of grass bending low. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gideon stepped up beside the fence, resting his hands on the wood, the same way she had. "You left something," he said. She nodded once. "I figured you'd find it." He waited. She didn't ask if he'd read it. Didn't ask anything at all. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable. Just full. Gideon looked out toward the mountains. "They're talking in town," he said. "I know. They're not wrong." That made her turn. Not quickly, not sharply, just enough. Gideon kept his eyes forward. You come out here, he went on. You spend time where people notice things like that. Ivy watched him. The world notices anyway, she said. Whether I'm here or not. He nodded slightly. That may be, he said, but it doesn't change what it looks like. Another pause. The wind pushed harder now, lifting the edge of her sleeve, brushing it back against her wrist. Gideon's hands tightened on the fence just enough to show it. You're young, he said. The words came out slow, measured, like he had turned them over more than once before letting them go. You've got time to build something different, something that fits better than this. He gestured slightly toward the land around them, the house beyond, the quiet that held it all together. I'm not that, he said. Ivy didn't interrupt, didn't argue. She just stood there, looking at him the way she always did, like she was listening to more than just the words. Gideon swallowed once. You deserve someone who can meet you where you are, he added. Not someone who's already passed most of it. That was when she stepped closer. Not all the way, just one step, enough that he could hear her breathing under the wind. You didn't ask me, she said. Gideon frowned slightly, not in anger, in confusion. Ask you what? What I want. The words didn't rise. They didn't push. They just landed. Gideon turned then, looked at her fully for the first time since he'd arrived. Her expression hadn't changed. Steady. Clear. You're telling me what I deserve, she went on. Like it's already decided. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Dusty had followed him partway out, now sitting a few yards back. The dog didn't move, didn't make a sound. Even the wind seemed to settle for a second. I'm trying to do right by you, Gideon said finally. Ivy shook her head, just once. You're trying to decide for me. That hung there between them. The mountains caught the last of the light, turning pale at the edges where the snow held. I don't need someone younger, she said. Gideon didn't answer. I don't need someone louder, she added. Her hand rested against the fence again, fingers brushing the worn grain of the wood. I need someone who knows when to stand still, she said, and when not to walk away. The words were quiet, but they didn't leave room for anything else. Gideon looked at her, really looked this time, at the dust on her skirt, the way her hair had come loose at the edges from the wind, the steady way she held her ground without pushing forward. Something shifted in his chest. Not sudden, not sharp, just enough to be noticed. I'm not what you think I am, he said. Ivy's mouth moved, almost a smile. Not quite. I know exactly what I think, she said. Another long pause. The kind that doesn't ask to be filled. Gideon turned back to the mountains. The light was almost gone now. We shouldn't do this, he said. The words came softer this time, less certain. Ivy didn't answer. She stepped back after a moment, just enough to give him the space he thought he needed. Her hand left the fence. All right, she said. No anger, no hurt showing, just a word. She walked back to her horse, untied the reins, moved with the same quiet care she always had. Before she mounted, she paused, looked at him once more. You didn't ask, she said again. Then she swung up into the saddle and turned the horse toward the road. Gideon didn't follow. He stood there until the sound of hooves faded into the wind. Dusty shifted beside him, sat down slowly, leaning his weight against Gideon's boot. The sky went dark, and for the first time in years, The quiet didn't feel like something he could carry. Gideon didn't sleep much that night. The wind moved steady along the walls, slipping through the same cracks it always had. The house creaked in the same places. Nothing new in the sound of it. But he kept waking. Once, just before dawn, he sat up and looked toward the table. The second chair was still there. The book lay where he had set it, unopened. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, sat there a moment, hands resting on his knees. The kind of still that comes before a man decides something. Then he stood. By morning, the frost hadn't lifted yet. The ground held that thin white edge that broke under a boot. Gideon moved faster than usual. Saddle cinched tight. Reins checked once. He didn't stop to fix anything along the fence. Dusty followed him to the gate. Stopped there, watching. "You stay," Gideon said. The dog didn't argue. Just sat down slow, eyes tracking him as he rode out. Larkspur wasn't expecting him that day. Not on a Thursday. The hitching rail in front of the school stood mostly empty. A wagon off to one side. A horse tied near the post office. Gideon didn't slow. He swung down in front of the schoolhouse and tied off without looking around. Inside, voices carried low. The scrape of chalk against a board. A few children shifting in their seats. Then the door opened. Ivy stepped out, closing it gently behind her. She stopped when she saw him. For a second, neither of them spoke. "It's not Tuesday," she said. "I know." She studied him, the same way she always had. But there was something held back now. Not distance, just caution. Gideon took his hat off, turned it once in his hands. "I couldn't wait," he said. The words came out plain. No weight added to them. Just truth. The wind moved between them again, softer here in town, caught between buildings instead of open land. Across the street, Harold Whitaker stood near the bank steps, watching, his son beside him. Gideon saw them, didn't turn away. Before anything else could happen, Harold stepped forward. His cane tapped once against the boardwalk. "Miss Reed," he said, "we had an understanding." Ivy didn't move. "I don't recall making one," she answered. His son shifted beside him. A little too eager. A little too sure. "You've been given opportunities here," the younger man said. "People are willing to overlook certain things." Gideon stepped forward then. Not fast, not hard, just enough to close the space. "She's not going anywhere," he said. The words landed heavier than they sounded. No raised voice, no threat. Just something settled in them that hadn't been there before. Harold held his gaze. For a moment, it looked like he might say more. Then he didn't. He tapped his cane once more and stepped back. The younger man followed, slower this time. The street opened again. Gideon turned back to Ivy. "I should have asked," he said. She didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat, pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth, unfolded it once, a ring, worn smooth along the edges, not polished, just cared for. He set it on the small ledge beside the schoolhouse door, didn't pick it up again. "I've been wrong before," he said. "Spent a long time being sure of things that weren't right." The wind lifted the edge of her sleeve again. She stepped closer. Not far. Just enough. "I don't know what comes next," he went on. "I'm not the man I was, not the man you might need." He paused. "But I won't walk away from something real. Not again." The words settled between them. No rush, no push. Ivy looked at the ring, then at him. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she moved it slightly, just enough that it sat closer to the center of the ledge. Not his side, not hers. Between. I didn't come here for what's easy, she said. Her voice stayed quiet, steady. I stayed for what felt right. Gideon nodded once. Slow. The school door opened behind her. A child's voice called her name. She didn't turn. Not yet. Then stay, he said. No flourish. No promise he couldn't keep. Just that. Ivy let out a breath. Small. Almost unnoticeable. Then she picked up the ring, turned it once in her fingers, and held it there. Spring came late that year. The snow held longer in the shadows along the ridge, but when it broke, it came fast. Grass pushing up through thawed ground, water running stronger through the creek. The porch had a second chair now, set beside the first, not perfectly matched, but close enough. Evenings didn't stay quiet the same way, not empty, just full in a different way. Sometimes there were words, sometimes not. Gideon still made coffee, 2 cups. This time, he didn't hesitate. Across the yard, Dusty lay stretched out in the sun, eyes closed. No need to watch the road anymore. And when the wind moved through the grass, it didn't carry the same weight it once had. It passed through and kept going. And maybe that's how life works more often than we admit. Not in big moments, not in loud declarations, but in quiet choices, made when no one is watching. Imagine standing where Gideon once stood, a man who had already decided his story was finished, the chair across the table empty, the second cup never poured, not because there was no one out there, but because he had stopped believing anyone would stay. And then someone does. Not to fix you, not to change you, just to sit across from you and say, without saying much at all, I see you. That kind of thing doesn't come with certainty. It doesn't come with guarantees. It asks something harder. It asks you to stay, to risk being wrong, to risk being seen. Gideon didn't find a new life. He chose one. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive when everything is ready. It arrives when you finally decide not to walk away from it. If you've ever stood at a crossroads like that, I'd like to know. Where were you when you had to choose between what felt safe and what felt real? There are more stories like this waiting, quiet ones, strong ones, the kind that stay with you long after the fire burns low. And if you're still here, you're already part of them.